undivided attention. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Chike Akua.
Right, thank you for that wonderful introduction. And thank you all for coming out this afternoon. I always like to begin with what time it is, not the time on your watch, but a great African-American scholar by the name of Dr. Benjamin E. Mays said it's 11:59 on the clock of destiny. And life is like a minute, only 60 seconds in it. Forced upon you, can't refuse it. Didn't seek it, didn't choose it, but it's up to you to use it. You'll suffer if you lose it, give account if you abuse it. It's only a minute, but eternity is in it. And with that minute, you, me, and we can change and transform the world. So for a few of you I see in the audience, we're here at our earlier session, and I always like to say, if you believe that we can change the world with everyone, please say Ashe. Ashe. Wonderful. So Ashe means I agree. It means let it be so, but it also represents the activating energy and the presence of the Spirit that is both within us and around us at all times. So I use that as a call and response when I'm presenting, because I want to, get feedback from you about a lot of things that I'll be sharing. I want to bring you greetings from Clark Atlanta University, one of our great HBCUs, historically black colleges and universities, where I'm honored to serve on the faculty in the Department of Educational Leadership. If you have your phone with you, there will be some very noteworthy things that you may want to get a picture of. And I'm reminded of the great words of a poet by the name of Listerveld Middleton, who says, sharpen your eye and tune your ear so you know what you see and understand what you hear. So we've heard it said before that a picture is worth what, everybody? 1,000 words. So I have some very important pictures and images to share with you that will reinforce some of the lessons that I'm going to share this afternoon. But you can't just look with your two physical eyes. You have to look with what ancient Africans called the ujat. Everybody say ujat. The ujat is the eye of all-seeing enlightenment that allows us to see with deep insight past the physical realm and into the mental and spiritual dimensions. So I want to talk for a little bit on the topic of education for transformation, keys to African-American student success. But as we're focusing on keys to African-American student success, I think what you'll find is that a number of the things that I'm going to share with you will be beneficial to all students. Ashe? Ashe. Okay, so with that in mind, let's go ahead and dig in, and then at the end, hopefully we'll have some time for some Q&A. An interesting statistical point to start on. For the first time in American history, students of color comprise the majority of public school students. So we're talking K through 12 education right now. So if now, for the first time in history, starting back in 2015, National Center of Education for Education Statistics determined that for the first time in America's history, that the majority of public school students were students of color, that is African American, that is Latinx, that is Asian and Pacific Islander, Native American, that they now comprise the majority of public school students. I think at that time in 2015, it was 50.1%. So it was a slim majority. However, that number will only be increasing, regardless of the political backlash of those who are not pleased with the fact that the numbers of people of color are growing in this country into what many of the demographers call the browning of America. As a matter of fact, when we look at population politics, I think it will be clear to see that that's why we're seeing some of the political backlash that we see as a result of those that are pushing for different points of view to be considered. But while the population has changed, politics, policies, practices, and procedures largely have not. Ashe? And that can be very frustrating to conscientious people who want to see us do better. When I say us, I'm talking about us as a nation. Ashe? It's very frustrating when we see people resistant to the type of cultural and demographic shifts that are taking place. So we have this demographic imperative now. If you're going to meet the needs of this growing population of students of color, it requires us to think differently and to enact different policies and procedures and practices. So when is the best time to start doing that, everybody? Right now. Right now. Absolutely, right now. But it's interesting. I've been to some places where they say, but we already have a lot of diversity. But I need for you to understand that diversity does not mean equity. Somebody say, break that down.
Break that down.
I'll never forget, I was invited to a small college in the Southeast. And as you know, before I go to speak somewhere, I always like to talk to the person who invited me to find out some of the campus dynamics of, what's going on. And my contact person shared with me that this particular college, they were very proud that they had just recently won an award where they were named the most diverse college in the Southeast. So they were very proud of that. They were asking me to speak at an MLK program. And my point of contact said, though we are the most diverse college in the Southeast, it's not reflected in our policies or in our hiring practices. So when I began to raise some of those questions, I guess they thought, me being the speaker at an MLK program, I was just going to say, hey, we shall overcome, and I have a dream, and all that kind of stuff. That's the Martin Luther King that has been mass marketed. That's not the real King. Ashe? So when I began asking questions about the fact, hey, this is wonderful. Y'all have your student population is 30% African American, 30% Latinx, very significant Asian and Pacific Islander population. Is that reflected in the faculty? And they got real quiet, just like it did here. And then I said, well, is that reflected in the leadership and the board of trustees? When we say representation matters, we're not talking about just putting token people in places to be figureheads and puppets. We're talking about the views and the values that different populations of people represent. Ashe? We're also talking about the knowledge base and insights and expertise that they have that can benefit the entire institution. Ashe? So with that in mind, I want to kind of use that as a frame for what I'm going to talk about. Though I'm talking about African American student achievement, it will impact the entire institution regardless of what institution you may happen to be at. So session one, what is education for transformation? I don't want to assume that we're all operating from the same definition, so I want to provide a definition for you when I coined this term. And it is simply this: education for transformation is the process of recapturing and practicing the ancient African and the African American tradition of educational excellence. One problem: most people don't know that tradition of excellence even exists. Deeper problem: most African Americans don't know that tradition of excellence exists, primarily because we are bombarded by so many daily images that portray us as pimps, players, criminals, and thugs. Ashe? And so this knowledge base that could transform institutions and transform lives is not largely known or understood, not because the information doesn't exist, but because it is not prioritized. Okay? And so earlier today, in our earlier session, we went back to a time where black people led the world in wealth creation, literary production, and scientific innovation. Yet again, a period of time most people are wholly unaware of. But there are answers to the problems that we face as human beings in that knowledge. But oftentimes it's not explored enough. So if you weren't here for that, I encourage you to check out the recording of that. Okay? One thing I forgot to do, which is characteristic in my culture, is to give honor to the ancestors. Because there's an African proverb which says, if we stand tall, it is because we stand on the shoulders of our ancestors. Or as Dr. Jacob Carruthers said, our stride is wide because we're walking in the footsteps of giants. Ashe? So whenever I'm teaching in any context, I always like to begin with my initial premise or my initial understanding with any students that I work with. But it becomes interesting when you consider African American students. And my initial premise is this: our children are chosen. Everybody say our children are chosen. Our students are chosen. And I believe our students are chosen for three things: greatness, excellence, and achievement. What are those three things, everybody? One more time. What are those three things? Greatness, excellence, and achievement. But we live in a nation that seems to prefer to gangsterize and criminalize young black males, and then objectify and hypersexualize young black females. And by objectify, I mean portraying them as objects of sexual pleasure rather than subjects worthy of dignity and respect. Ashe? And so these images, as I said, are placed in broad media circulation all over the world. And it begins to impact not only how people see African Americans, it begins to impact how African Americans see themselves. Never underestimate the impact of injected oppression. I'm going to say that again. Never underestimate the impact of injected oppression. And that's what causes some of our students to use disparaging words against their own culture because they haven't been taught the truth about their culture. Ashe? But what you're looking at now are the faces of students who have had an experience where they learned the truth. And it becomes a serious awakening and rebirth for them to understand the truth of who they are and where they come from. This particular picture was taken at Bakersfield College, and that's Dr. Paula Parks in the foreground to the right of me. We've been doing some work with them and a number of other colleges in California and throughout the country. But my presentation is broken into sessions, as I mentioned earlier. And session 2 says, what is cultural identity theft and identity restoration? And so I discussed this in my book, Honoring Our Ancestral Obligations, which you all may have an opportunity to get later on. Let me say, Dr. Naeem Akbar tells us in his book, Know Thyself, that the first function of education is to provide identity. I want you to remember that as we look at this these next few slides. I was logging into my email account a few years ago, and the news headline of the day came up with this picture. And it said, identity theft is the fastest growing crime in America. And when I began to think about that, and I don't know about you, but, well, let me ask, how many of you, either you or someone you know, has been a victim of identity theft? Can I just see a show of hands? Keep your hand up, look around the room. So it's just about most of us in here, probably 90% of us in here. And that's usually the case whenever I ask that question to an audience, right? I was a victim of identity theft. Somebody stole into my car, this was years ago, someone stole my 2 checkbooks and started writing checks all over town. And of course, the first thing I did was call the bank, tell them to shut my account down, but then I go online and I see this person just spending money all over town. But in the process of going through that, I had a dramatic awakening, and that is that African Americans have experienced what I call cultural identity theft. You see, regular identity theft is when someone steals your personal information, uses that information to gain access to your resources, and the victim becomes confused and angry and disillusioned because it can take a long time to clean that up, and they must spend considerable time doing that. But then when I had that instant awakening that African Americans have experienced cultural identity theft, that's the process of stealing a people's story. Stealing their story, their perspective, their history of accomplishments and achievement, and replacing it with a narrative of historical and contemporary pathology. In other words, making it seem like they come from those images that I mentioned before, pimps, players, criminals, and thugs. Well, what's interesting is when you think about all of your different accounts that you have, if you want access to your savings, checking, investments, email, social media, streaming services, the first thing that you have to do before you gain access to any of those things is authenticate your identity. And what we want young people to know, what we want leaders and teachers and professors to know, is that if we want our students to attain their very best, we have to help them to authenticate their identity as well in a world that is circulating inauthentic images. So history and culture are the access codes to help our students to become their best. So when I shared my theory of cultural identity theft with my advisor and elder, Dr. Joyce King, she said, well, Chike, that's interesting, but it's not just identity theft, cultural identity theft, it's identity replacement. And you can get paid big money in America to act like these images that we see on the screen now. Because these images are manufactured, not just made, but manufactured. If you make something, you're making one. But if you're manufacturing something, what are you doing? Mass producing it. So these images are mass produced and placed in broad circulation, not only all over America, but all over the world. And as I said, you can get paid big money to act like those images, even if you don't come from a background like that. You can get paid so much money, the more outrageous you act, the more money we'll give you. And if you act really outrageous, you might be able to get yourself a contract for your own reality show. Ashe? I mean, if you get enough likes on social media, doesn't matter how degenerate what you're doing is, you're just looking for likes. You're not looking for the quality of what you're doing. And so this is something that we have to contend with. So listen, everybody, what does that cause, class? What does that cause?
Cultural confusion.
It causes cultural confusion because it makes other people think this is what it means to be black. But you know what's worse than that? What's worse than that is that when black people think that that's what it means to be black. Ashe? Is this making sense? Okay, so that cultural confusion has deep consequences. It leads to the justification of the killing of Trayvon Martin, the justification of the strangling of Eric Garner by New York police for simply selling cigarettes, the killing of Sandra Bland while in police custody, the killing of Mike Brown, and so many others. Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Rayshard Brooks, and the most recent heinous attack that many of us witnessed. And so those images impact how we respond to one another. And it causes what Dr. Asa Hilliard and Dr. Wade Nobles have called conceptual incarceration. And what happens is it makes it difficult for people to see beyond those images. Let me see if I can explain to you what I mean by that. When I was in high school, I was a struggling student, and I had a 1.9 GPA. Now, usually when I share with an audience that at one time I had a 1.9 GPA, they gasp like, no, not you, Dr. Akua, but y'all looking at me like, yeah, you look pretty dumb to me. Let me try again. This is something we can do to inspire our students. Let me try that again. At one time, I had a 1.9 GPA.
Oh, no.
Yeah. That's a little better, but some of y'all need to still work on that, okay? But there was one class that I did well in. And I really needed that class because none of the other classes was I doing well in. And that class was expository writing. And every Friday we would turn in a paper, and every Monday the teacher would have it for us graded. And I couldn't wait to get that paper because I knew that was going to probably be the only good grade I had that week. And I felt good about my writing. And I always got either a 90, a 95, or 100 on the paper. Well, one Monday when I was waiting for my paper to be passed back, I received my paper, but there was no grade on it. It just said, see me. Anybody else got one of those papers before? I know I'm not the only one. Anybody else? Okay. So I went up to see the teacher, and he said, oh, yeah, now I remember why I wanted to see you. And he looked at my paper, and he said, what does this word mean? I told him what the word meant. He said, well, what does this word mean? I told him what the word meant. He said, well, what does this word mean? I told him what the word meant, the dictionary definition, and the definition in the context of how I used it in the paper. But he went through 5 or 6 different words. And after I gave him the correct answer, he still just looked at me and said, you didn't write this paper. Now, let me remind you that he had seen my writing before. And my writing before was 90s, 95s, and 100s. So he just looked at me and said, you didn't write this paper. I said, yes, I did write this paper. But something about his education and socialization told him that a young person who looked like me should not be able to write like this. Ashe? He didn't know that by the age of 25, I would write my first book. He didn't know that by the age of 35, I would have written 8 books. He didn't know that I would go on to become a language arts teacher like him, a teacher of the year, putting on my own education conference, becoming a national and international consultant. putting on my own conference called the Teacher Transformation Institute, where teachers and leaders would come from all over America and even outside of America to be trained in some of the strategies that I would share. He didn't know that Ebony Magazine would name me one of his 50 leaders of tomorrow, or that I'd be featured in Black Enterprise Magazine. He didn't see any of that from me. And I don't share that with you to impress you, but to impress upon you that what you see in your students makes all the difference in the world. And what you don't see in them makes all the difference in the world as well. Ashe? Ashe. So this idea of conceptual incarceration affects us as teachers, as professors, as leaders, because just because we have a little bit more training or education does not mean that we're not subject to those images that I was mentioning to you before. It creates conceptual incarceration. So we may see a young person come in our class who looks like some of the stereotypical images that we see, but there's so much more going on the inside. Ashe? Ashe. Dr. Asa Hilliard said, today the formal education of most people of African ancestry is accomplished in systems that take us far away from ourselves. What we noted this morning during my presentation is that you could go from pre-K to postdoctorate and learn nothing about the African or African American contribution to whatever subject you're learning about or whatever discipline you're studying. Ashe? Ashe. And we also learned this morning that the lack of that knowledge diminishes everyone, not just African Americans, because each cultural group comes with a gift to share with humanity. But when one culture or several cultures humanity and history is suppressed, we are all diminished as a result of that. Ashe? Ashe. So Dr. Naeem Akbar reminds us when we talk about diversity that presence does not equal power. So diversity isn't enough. What are the people that are present on campus? What kind of power that they do they have? Barudi Kafele, one of my colleagues, he says, lacking cultural competence is equivalent to teaching a subject you know nothing about. Ashe? So for us then, education is identity restoration. Education is identity restoration. And Asa Hilliard tells us the only thing standing between us and excellence is our beliefs. It's only our beliefs. So there's an African proverb that says, if the wise village elders don't teach the youth, the village idiots most certainly will. And we see the village idiots at work all day, every day, 24/7. They don't even take any days off. Ashe? So we really got to be on top of our game. All right? So in this next session, what I want to talk about is an aspect that we can use to better understand those that we serve. In a multicultural education, that should allow the students to be provided with a perspective. Whatever is being studied, we want to see, well, what is the Latinx perspective? What's the African American perspective? What is the Asian Pacific Islander perspective on whatever issue or subject or discipline that we're studying, right? So with that in mind, I want to talk about what is African-centered education, because this would be a big part of the African American perspective. And African-centered education is simply centering ourselves and students in the best of our culture to examine and analyze information, meet needs, and solve problems. More specifically, centering ourselves and students in the best of African culture to examine and analyze information, meet needs, and solve problems in Black communities. So a lot of times when Black students go to school, they are left with knowledge and skills that allows them to meet needs and solve problems in other people's communities and not their own. Ashe? Give you a quick example of what I mean. A lot of times we get educated away from our community. I'll never forget a transformational experience I had in my first semester as a doctoral student. I enjoy learning, so I was enjoying the class that I was in. It was a 3-hour class, but at about the 1 hour, hour and a half mark, the professor gave us a little 10-minute break to use the restroom or get a snack, whatever we wanted to do. I went out in the hall and I saw something that shocked me. I saw 2 young men about to fight. And immediately I I turned back into the middle school teacher that I used to be. I'm like, this cannot be happening. This is a college campus, right? Or maybe they're high school students at a special program here. I don't know what it was, but they were about to fight. I mean, they were about to show enough throw down. But I was able to talk them both down, and they did not fight, thankfully. So I went back into class and I sat down, and a still small voice within me said, don't ever get so educated that you can't talk to brothers like that. Because the higher we go up in education, we learn a language that takes us away from our own communities. And if I didn't know how to talk to those brothers, they would have ended up fighting. And so education should teach us how to meet needs and solve problems in our own communities. And so one of the things that I developed was elements of African-centered education. There are 15 that I'll run through real quick. Probably spend about a minute on each one. Ashe? And I'm sharing this with you in the hopes that maybe you can find some of these to infuse into your teaching. It would be very difficult to infuse all of them, but if you can find a few here and there that you can begin to think about and infuse into your course syllabus, into your lessons, into your discussions, and that would be very helpful, okay? So ACE is an acronym for African-Centered Education. Number one, ACE places Africa, African people, and African points of view at the center of all things studied. So whatever you're studying about, whatever you're teaching to your students, there ought to be a perspective from African-American people. Ashe? Now, bearing in mind, African people are not monolithic. We know that. No group of people is monolithic. But there are certain ideas that predominate in certain communities. Ashe? And that's what we want to be familiar with. African-centered education, ACE, requires an African value system. You say that, African value system? Well, what difference does a different value system make? It makes a big difference. And I'll give you a couple of examples. What you see at the bottom of your screen right here is the ancient Neter or goddess Ma'at, coming out of the Nile Valley of Africa. Ma'at represented 7 principles, if you will repeat these after me. Truth, justice, righteousness, reciprocity, balance, order, and harmony. And it was said that the universe was created using those 7 principles, and that the universe must be could only be sustained by utilizing those principles. One of the ancient texts, sacred texts, says the balancing of the land is in Ma'at, truth, justice, and righteousness. That's an example of traditional African values. Let me give you another example of traditional African values. Everybody say Ubuntu. Ubuntu is a Central African concept that means I am because we are. Because we are, therefore I am. I can do nothing without you. You can do nothing without me. We are one. But in the American context, much of the value system that we are steeped in is one of hyper-individualism. That is one that is absolutely countercultural to African values. Ashe? So this question of values is key. I come from a culture that is communal, cooperative, and collective. But I live in a society that is competitive, individualistic, and contentious. And so I have to, wherever I go, whatever I do, I have to make a distinction between my authentic cultural values and the ones that have been imposed upon me. Ashe? Another very, very important concept of values that I talk about in the book is azotsi. Actually, it's pronounced asusi. Everybody say asusi? Asusi. And this comes from Ghana, where many of us went on a study tour this past year. Azusi means duties, responsibilities, and obligations. Now in America, we talk about rights. I have rights. Especially even in the African American community, we've had to talk about rights because we didn't have all of our rights. Ashe? But in the African context, and if you have to listen carefully because this will almost sound oppressive if you don't hear the whole thing. You didn't have rights. In the African context, you didn't have rights. You had asusi. You had duties, responsibilities, and obligations. And when everybody in the community is living up to their asusi, their duties, responsibilities, and obligations, then your rights are taken care of. Ashe? This is very different. So it's important to understand these different cultural nuances. Number 4, ACE helps students critically examine how the subject or object of study is related to the image and interests of Africa and African people. The image and interest. There are a lot of things that are not created in our image, and they're definitely not in our interest. Ashe? The prison industrial complex is not it's in the image, but it's not in the interest of African American people. Ashe? The public miseducation school system is not in the interest of African American students. Ashe? So we want to analyze whether it's in the image or interest of Africa and African people. And please understand, whenever I say Africa or African, I'm talking about black people, wherever they happen to be. And I'll get into why I'm using this terminology shortly. ACE taps into the spirit of the students. Now, in the Western world, this concept of spirit and spirituality is very debatable. Ashe? It's the subject of many philosophical debate. In the African world, that is not a debate. That's a given. And in many other cultures and indigenous societies, it's not a debate, it's a given. So ACE taps into the spirit of the students. Number 5, ACE requires a sharp orientation towards social justice. If you want to see students engaged, speak to them about the issues in their communities, and you'll find a level of engagement you might not have thought was possible. Number 6, ACE requires methods that are unique and indigenous to the nature and needs of African students. Scientific research has demonstrated that there are certain methods that unlock, unleash, and release the brilliance and the genius of African American students. Ashe? Number 7, ACE requires a consciousness of victory. This is so important. Instead of dwelling on oppression. Doesn't mean we don't have a perspective on oppression. Doesn't mean we're not going to talk about oppression. But it requires a consciousness of victory. That it prioritizes and privileges the stories of how we were able to overcome regardless of what roadblocks were placed in front of us. The next one, ACE asks the simple question of all things: is it good for African people? Haki Madhubuti says, is it best for African people? So whatever concept, idea that you are discussing or studying with your students, is it good for African people? Number 9. Oh, wait, let me go back, because somebody from one of you all's local newspapers wanted to interview me because I'm based just outside of Atlanta. And they're about to build this. They've appropriated multi-millions of dollars to build Cop City. Have y'all heard about this?
No.
Yeah, I heard.
Cop City. It's an entire city that has all of these things that are utilized for training law enforcement. But they're displacing a number of African Americans to do that at a time also when we know that the relationship between African Americans and the law enforcement community is not good. So just using this one, we can ask, is it good for African American people? So these are the questions that must be raised. Number 9, ACE requires an understanding of the Pan-African perspective, that wherever we happen to be, that we're an African people. And one of the things that we've discovered is that languages have separated us. So you may have a slave ship that came through the islands of the Caribbean. Mama was dropped off in Jamaica, daddy was dropped off in Puerto Rico, the brother was dropped off in Florida, the daughter was dropped off in South Carolina. And what we find is you have people who are related, but they're disconnected as a result of language. The Pan-African perspective says wherever we happen to be, whether we're in America, in the islands of the Caribbean, whether it's Africans in Europe or Africans on the continent, we're still one people. And the fact that we don't recognize that is really problematic because we get conquered when we're disunified. And divide and conquer was the primary method that the colonizer used. Ashe? So Marimba Ani says, we are not African because we were born in Africa, but because Africa was born in us. Number 10, ACE promotes an understanding and appreciation for all cultures. One of the biggest lies that was ever told is that we're promoting hate. I actually had somebody to accuse me of that one time. And I said, so because I raise issues of inequity, he said I was being divisive. So because I'm raising issues of inequity, I'm being divisive? So your inequitable and oppressive practices aren't divisive though, right? Do you see what's happening here? So ACE, African-centered education, promotes understanding and appreciation for all cultures. So the fact that I lift up my own does not mean that I have to diminish others. But I also understand that I bring an analysis to bear, a political, economic, and cultural analysis to bear. And some people might not like that analysis, but that's not going to stop me from telling it. Ashe? Sure. Number 11, ACE requires the restoration of African history and identity. We talked about cultural identity theft and so forth. But what does that mean? Let me see if I can give you a quick example. I'm reminded of this late in the last quarter of last year. If you don't know your history, then you might have thought that that was your queen. And you might have been in mourning. But the world found out that a lot of people celebrated when this queen passed. So this is not my royal family, in other words. Ashe? And what most African Americans have not been exposed to is what their own royalty looks like. We have not engaged our critical thinking lenses, because if we did, we would understand that the British have invaded almost 90% of the countries on the globe. Let that settle in for a second. 90%. The analysis of almost 200 countries in the world found only 22 which had never experienced an invasion by the British. 9 out of every 10 countries have been invaded by them. That would change your perspective then. Knowing that would change your perspective when you find out that the Queen of England died. Ashe? Not only that, let's take it a step further and ask the question that Amos Wilson asked. If there were not a direct relationship between history and money, history and power, history and rulership, history and domination, then why is it that the European rewrote history? Ashe? Number 12, ACE requires social emotional learning strategies to help resolve the multi-generational unaddressed trauma of the Ma'afa. The Ma'afa is the catastrophic interruption of African civilization and sovereignty. Many people refer to it as slavery, but slavery was supposedly abolished with the completion of the Civil War. But the Ma'afa is still going on. It is the continuation of, it is that, and it is everything that came after that. Ashe? And we have been 400 years without therapy. Think about that. African people experienced physical trauma, daily sexual abuse, starvation and hunger, dehydration, family separation, rape, lynching, all these different things, and never received therapy for that. 400 years without therapy. You know who else? White folk never received therapy. They never received therapy to unpack how their ancestors had the capacity to do this to other human beings. Not only did they not receive therapy, they're trying to erase the remembrance of it. Are y'all hearing what I'm saying? So ACE requires social emotional learning strategies to help resolve the multi-generational, intergenerational, unaddressed trauma. Number 13, ACE requires an understanding of cooperative economic strategies. It doesn't make sense for me to have all of this knowledge, all of this consciousness, but to have no capital to do anything with it. So yeah, I can run down my history and my culture. I can run down the social emotional learning strategies, but now I can't pay my rent, can't pay my mortgage, can't take care of my children. That would be a problem. Ashe? So I need an education that's going to provide me with an understanding of cooperative economic strategies. Did you know that upwards of 85% of lynchings that occurred in the late 1800s, those lynchings were against black business leaders, black business owners who were making a lot of money, so much money that it was more than the whites in their area, and their businesses and even entire towns were decimated. Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma, Rosewood in Florida, and many other communities like that, all black communities. Ashe? So it's almost like economic advancement has been traumatized out of us. I want you to think about that for a minute. Number 14, ACE prepares children for sovereignty. Now, I want to be clear. When we talk about African-centered education, that's different from issues of equity and accountability. We need equity and accountability. Let's be very clear about that. But what I'm talking about goes far beyond equity and accountability to restoring our sovereignty as a people, where we can be respected as a nation unto ourselves once again, with continental connections back to Africa. ACE prepares students to, this is important, defend what we have developed and protect what we have produced. Do you notice that whenever we seek to do that, we're accused of being violent? Imagine the perpetrators and the purveyors of violence. Imagine the oppressor accusing the oppressed of violence. We're standing on stolen land. Everything that you see around you was stolen. Y'all didn't hear what I just said. But you need to understand the orientation of what happens when people wake up from the deep fog of oppressive sleep that comes about as a result of miseducation. Ashe?
Sure.
So as I close, Dr. Joyce King asked the question, whose knowledge is worth knowing? I don't ask you to agree with anything that I have said. I'm not after agreement. What I'm after is understanding. Whenever we talk about some of these challenging ideas and concepts, I'm not looking for your agreement. I'm just asking you to understand my perspective. And I'd like to know your perspective. And I may not agree with you, but at least if we understand each other's perspective, then maybe we can act a little more respectably amongst each other and take each other's perspective into account when we're making decisions. Ashe? So with that being said, I want to close with a couple of quotes that I usually close with, and one is from Fannie Lou Hamer, who said, "Never forget where you came from, and always praise the bridges that carried you over." And if we understand that, then we will understand why James Baldwin said, "Our crowns have been bought and paid for. All we have to do is put them on our heads." Thank you all so much. All right, so we have a few minutes for Q&A. If anybody has any questions or comments or statements based on some of what we're sharing. Yes?
Can you go back to number 6 of the ACE?
Yes.
I'm trying to figure out number 6.
Number 6. Boom, there we go.
Number 6. Methods. Okay.
Mhm.
Can you elaborate on that? Because I work with students sometimes, mentoring. Can you talk about methods?
Sure.
Your methods, just one or two.
Sure. So a lot of times we say, okay, we're going to go and we're going to reach these students, and we put something together, and the students aren't quite as receptive as we thought they should have been. And what I have, and I've heard, adults say this oftentimes, "Oh, these kids don't care. I tried to share this with them. I tried to do, they don't care. They don't want to learn," right? Well, what may not have been taken into account was the methods that you used. So just giving a lecture may not do it. So I use a lot of call and response when I'm speaking. So that's why I have you saying "Ashe" and saying things after me, repeating certain words. That's one method. Is call and response. If you go to a black church, you know call and response, right? And for somebody who's never been to a black church before, you hear the preacher preaching and people are talking and saying, "Amen, go ahead, teach, preach, go ahead, brother," all that kind of stuff. That's part of the African American cultural communication tradition, right? So call and response would be one method. Tactile would be another method. That means using things that a person can touch, right? Because we work with our hands. Bodily and kinesthetic movement. One of the things that has been problematized and even criminalized is the fact that young black boys are very energetic. And if they can't sit still for as long as you would like for them to sit still, it's assumed that they have a learning problem or that they're hyperactive. No, they have a power and an energy about them that is oftentimes squashed when they go into public schools. In the research literature, they refer to it as spirit killing, that it kills the very spirit of the children. Dr. Jawanzi Kunjufu, in his book, Countering the Conspiracy to Destroy Black Boys, he calls the fourth grade failure syndrome. That when black boys enter into school, they enter in highly intelligent, extremely inquisitive, and very energetic. But by the fourth grade, they begin to mentally check out because those qualities have been suppressed within them, and they're seen as a problem rather than as people. So you have to take into account, if I know that you're very, very energetic, then I have to take that into account in my lesson plans. I had a principal that wanted to meet with me because he was having problems with his boys. He said, man, every day I got a line of black boys outside my office because they're fighting. So I said something that I knew he wasn't going to expect. I said, so let them fight. He looked at me like I had 3 heads. He said, what do you mean let them fight? We don't want them fighting. I said, yes, we do. I said, I'm looking for warriors. But you must discipline their fighting. So I can introduce you to a martial arts instructor or to a boxing instructor. You start that program in the school, I promise you, the same boys that are out of control will be your leaders in the school. And then once they reach a certain level, you make them your ambassadors. You give them a polo shirt. You have them standing posts. Whenever there's a visitor to the school, you have them to escort that visitor to their location. The very ones that are the biggest problem become your leaders. Why? Because you changed your methods. Never heard from that principal again. But I know that works because I've seen that work. Ashe? Ashe. So instead of trying to take that energy out of our young boys, we have to know the methods to be able to reach and teach them. But these are not the types of things that are commonly taught in the schools of education in most colleges and universities, okay? So we have the bodily kinesthetic. Dance is another one. Dancing, drumming, call and response we talked about. So there are a number of different modalities that can be used, methods that can be used to unleash and release the genius in African American students. So thank you for that question. Yes?
Thank you so much for coming out. So it's extremely helpful. I'm just curious, just as an educator myself and those of us in the room and even beyond, a lot of this information is fairly, I would say, new and like being introduced to. Mm-hmm. And if we've come up in this current institution of like education without this knowledge, without this cultural identity intact, especially those of us that are Black, African American, what are some of the strategies or methods that we can use to properly get equipped and informed to even be able to implement that for our students?
Well, the best way, that's why I wrote the book. So shameless plug for the book, right? I wrote the book Honoring Our Ancestral Obligations for that very purpose. I'm looking for that slide. Because I wanted to have a resource that teachers and leaders could turn to. There it is right there. Because guess what? I didn't grow up with this either. Nothing of what I shared this morning or this afternoon was taught to me in elementary, middle school, high school, undergrad, master's program, or doctoral program. As I said before, you can go from pre-K to postdoctorate in this education system and learn nothing about your own culture, right? So I had to teach it to myself, and then I made a decision and a determination to share that message with others. So that's why I publish books. I didn't look for a contract from a large publishing house. I knew that some of my ideas were controversial enough that maybe another publishing house might not be interested in publishing that, and I don't want to put my work into the hands of somebody with that kind of power. In addition to that, it was an act of self-conscious self-determination that we needed to have our own publishing companies. And so that is why my work is self-published, but it is peer-reviewed by a number of national and international scholars, okay? So that's the first book that I would recommend to you. And I would say that more information like this is out there. That's why I cited different scholars in my presentation. But many of those scholars you may never have heard of, because even if you go through a master's or doctoral program, you're introduced to scholars that don't look like you. Or if they do look like you, their thoughts are based on scholars that don't look like you. That's why I put that graphic up there of Asa Hilliard saying most of us are educated in systems that take us far away from ourselves. So you then have to be very, very intentional to seek out voices and views and values of those that are in harmony with your authentic culture. Okay? So thank you for that question. All right. Anybody else?
Dr. Akua,
Yes.
we get some concerns from faculty that, us centering maybe African education might water down or, impact the academic rigor of said discipline. What would be your response to that?
How can centering the voices, the views, the values, the perspectives, the contributions and accomplishments of African Americans, how can that water down the curriculum when it should be a central part of the curriculum? And that goes back to the fact that many of our faculty were never taught these things either. So they don't place any type of value on these kinds of things. Even though there would be no America, hear me well, there would be no America without these African contributions. And I'm not talking about America as a result of the labor of African Americans through slavery. It wasn't just, as Karenga says, it wasn't just our brawn, it was our brains. If you were here this morning in my presentation, I showed the intellectual accomplishments that African people brought to this country that were falsified. And I gave visual documentation along with primary resources to back up what I was saying, and it's expressed in the book. So a statement like that, to me, comes from a place of ignorance, meaning they just don't know. And that's why forums like this are so important. Now, once the information is shared and you still refuse to acknowledge it, that's more on that person, but that also speaks to the deeply pathological nature of white supremacy ideology. That I can put all of the empirical evidence in front of you and still you can't see it. Still you expect me to bow down to your way, which is a way that is dying out right now and in need of the solutions that people of color have to change the situation. But as I said, that's part of the pathology of white supremacy ideology. Okay, so thank you for that question. All right. As I close, when you hear me talk, and I use words like white supremacy ideology, or you hear me talk about white people or about black people, you could assume that I'm talking about color. So I need to clarify something real quick. Of everything that I've said, I'm really not talking about color. I'm talking about consciousness about culture. Ashe? There's a big difference between that. Your color is your color. Whatever that is, fine. That's not what I'm here to deal with. I'm here to talk about your consciousness about culture. That means everybody of any color is invited to the party, because everybody of any color or any culture can exhibit a certain level of consciousness that brings us all together and that helps us to address these different issues of equity and diversity and accountability. Ashe? So thank you all for your time and attention. And Dr. Boland, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you again, Dr. Akua. We have wore you out this afternoon, but you're still standing. We appreciate you from this earlier afternoon and today's afternoon session. You really brought a wealth of knowledge that I hope each and every one of you has taken something away to bring back to your organizations, into your spaces, into your practice. As faculty, you all have an awesome responsibility as you all really shape culture here at the campus and really have the capacity to shift the climate. And so we thank you in advance for whatever, portion of this content knowledge that you'll take to inform your practice. If you went ahead and left your name on the sign-in sheet, we'll be in touch with you tomorrow afternoon to let you know if you've grabbed won a book through the raffle, Dr. Akua's most recent publication on 7 Steps to Black Student Success. There is also an opportunity if you're like, I can't wait for the raffle, to purchase a book before you leave here today. And I think that's it. We've got 2 other fantastic speakers that are also part of our 3-part distinguished lecture speaker series for the Black Heritage Month calendar. So please jump onto the webpage. You can look at that through our events calendar or on our IEDJ webpage. And I think that's it. Again, thank you so much, you all, for your time. Another special note of gratitude to Dr. Akua, and have a blessed rest of the afternoon. Take care.
Again, sir.